Welcome everyone. I see we've got a good stable number of numbers that have logged in, so let's get on today with today's webinar. So first of all, I want to welcome you to the BioTech webinar series. I'm Zara Champion. I'm the Executive Director of BioTech New Zealand. We're a member-based organisation, and for all of you who are members, thank you very much. We're doing some great work out there, so I appreciate your membership. And those who are not members, please jump on our website and check out the things that we're doing. It would be great to see you as a member. I also want to highlight that this webinar today is brought to you by Bioscience Enterprise Program as well. This is a program that's run out of the University of Auckland, and it's a 1 or 2 year program. So you either do your postgraduate diploma and then you go on to your master's, or you can just do the master's. It's an interdisciplinary program that blends the best of science and business and gives these students the skills to move into the business world with confidence. Just want to let you know as well, this is a time where those students will be looking for summer interns. And so this is a great time to be thinking as an organisation whether you are interested or thinking about a student. A lot of those students that you pick up over the summer will move in through their masters and they'll do a summer studentship. So again, this is a really good time to be thinking for your business. Is it the right time to get a student? If you are interested in a student, please just contact me, or you'll see there's a chat function, just pop your name in there, or you can go to the BioTech website and contact me directly. So before we get underway, I just have a few housekeeping rules that we want to follow today. So we have a 1 hour is scheduled for this meeting, so that includes the Q&A as well. You've all come on at mute, so what I'd like you to do is to submit any questions in the Q&A function. And again, we will have the questions at the end of the session. And also we're videotaping this, and so you will receive a link to this when we email you next week. So I would like, the slides are a little different than I thought. So I would like to introduce today Dr. Trevor Stuthridge, who is the Research Director of Ag Research. Now, Dr. Trevor Stuthridge joined Ag Research in 2019. I also want to highlight that he is now one of our new BioTech Executive Council members. So very, very excited about that. Trevor has extensive New Zealand and international executive and governance experience in R&D, innovation, technology, commercialisation in the private industry, bioeconomy and clean tech sectors. So Trevor was the Executive Vice President for FP Innovations, which is the world's largest not-for-profit forestry sector research organisation in Canada. He has also been the General Manager of Sustainable Design at Scion. So I'd like to introduce Trevor, and I will leave the floor to you, Trevor.
Zara. Okay, Zara, can you confirm you've got the full screen?
Yes, I can see that, and I.
Thank you. Okay, look, kia ora tātou everyone. Many thanks for signing on to the webinar, and many thanks for the opportunity to talk to you about the bioeconomy activities. I'm conscious that some of you may have seen some of this messaging before, but I think there's some important elements of the bioeconomy for New Zealand that I'd like to re-emphasise for those who have heard before, and maybe welcome your feedback on Q&A around that as well. As Zara said, I'm the Research Director for Ag Research, and this work is really based around my previous work. I'm just going to put this in here, excuse me for a moment. Yeah, this is really based on the 5 years that I spent in Canada and also working with Scandinavians around the bioeconomy activity. So it reflects my observations of what is working in Canada and why some of these things I think are valuable to New Zealand. It also reflects how some of these things are common to New Zealand and therefore could be also some advantages. There are some other elements to New Zealand, I think, that are different from Canada that we may also be advantage to us. So this perspective is certainly a personal perspective of what I observed in Canada as to why I think they're evolving a strong bioeconomy and what we might learn from that. I will touch briefly on the other activities in Scandinavia, but primarily because the approaches are very similar in Scandinavia as they are in Canada, I'll tend to use Canadian examples. The first point to make is we're in a changing environment where there's a great deal of focus from the society around a number of elements that are very much related to the bioeconomy and very much aligned to what the bioeconomy can now deliver. So we speak of this desire for green communities, lightweight or electric or biofuels-based sustainable transportation, and then healthy living. So people wanting to have a healthy living environment through bioeconomy. What that really means in green communities is opportunities for urban carbon storage. So the ability to have green building systems, low waste management, and waste-free cycling in urban environments is a great opportunity to store carbon in the urban environment. The difference is that when you build a low carbon city and store carbon in it, it stays in there for some time, of course, because it's a city. And so when you store carbon in buildings, then you've essentially got a carbon storage mechanism. Sustainable transportation is every time we lower the carbon footprint of transportation, by definition, because of our reliance on transportation, we lower the carbon content of our goods and services because they all rely on some form of transportation. So low carbon transportation, either in the use of alternative fuel systems or by using biocomposites and biomaterials in the transportation vehicles, all leads effectively to a low carbon goods and services focus. And then with respect to the healthy living area, what people are doing these days is they accept that low carbon is useful, but they really want to see other functionalities from low carbon products or bioeconomy products that go beyond simply its footprint in terms of how it might be biocompatible or it might be reusable in their waste management systems. Some of the drivers for the bioeconomy, I'm sure many of you are familiar with. There are global imperatives around greenhouse gas emissions, CO2 emissions. So this is the Canadian data. As you can see, as of this year, they had a very big challenge because their target is 612 megatons per year. And without any low carbon measures, they're certainly not going to hit that target. And even with current measures that they're working through, like forestry adaptation and so forth, they're still well above the current target. So embracing the bioeconomy is really critical to lower the carbon footprint of our society in these various countries that are looking for climate change mitigation. One of the important benefits of the bioeconomy is that it relies on feedstocks from rural environments, essentially, whether that's forestry or agricultural feedstocks or fit-for-purpose feedstocks. That means that it offers real benefits to resource-dependent communities, because that's usually where these communities reside, is in the areas where the feedstocks come from, whether it's farming or forestry or otherwise. Future-proofing these resource-dependent communities is critical for retention of jobs and generational sustainability of the communities, particularly as some of the traditional industries are challenged by changing markets and changing needs. And then, as with New Zealand, in Canada, there's a significant focus on the agricultural sector and forest sector as a large source of GDP. We have substantial resources in New Zealand around forestry and agriculture that could be better used. One of the challenges is that in these primary industries, we have very high employment rates relative to size. So these are industries that have very significant primary jobs related to communities that are in the rural environment. And then thirdly, these are industries that generate large amounts of waste materials that ought to be effectively reused in the bioeconomy through biotechnology or otherwise. And so we need to use that in order to make the economic envelope of these industries future-proofed. And finally, many of these industries, as in this case the forest industry, are having to adjust to product life cycles. So obviously with the emergence of e-printing and e-technologies, then the demand for newsprint and copy paper, for example, is significantly reducing. Traditional building systems that use lumber are also starting to reduce and be replaced by engineered wood products. We're seeing bioenergy through the use of pellets, wood pellets grow, certainly in Europe. Some growth in biofuels, although the battery technology is so far advanced now that in some ways maybe biofuels will be less impactful than we might have suggested it would be even 10 years ago. Then we have new products like bioplastics, biocomposites, biochemicals, and carbon fibre, all of which are relatively new to the bioeconomy and new to the markets, but need to grow if we're going to substitute the current feedstocks from forestry and agriculture that go to things like copy paper and newsprint into other alternative products. So learning to get ahead of that curve and create and de-risk these technologies and these products is critical if these sectors are going to survive effectively going forward. Less so in the agricultural sector, where obviously food is the main product, but there are still significant challenges to that sector in terms of low carbon and also using other products that come off the farms and off the agricultural systems. So what has Canada done to help itself, ready itself for the bioeconomy opportunities and address those challenges? And what can New Zealand do about it as well? Well, I think one thing that Canada has done, which I think we should see in New Zealand if we could, is really creating some sector alignment. So while I was over in Canada, some of the things we helped work with on are things like a forest bioeconomy framework, which was a collective government industry framework that was collectively joined together across the provinces and across federal government to really say this is the target focus for the bioeconomy in Canada, and these are how we measure our success in that place. So that was at a national level. And then, because Canada has a provincial system, they also created innovation strategies for each of the provinces, such as the Clean Tech Innovation Strategy for BC forest sector. Now, the advantage for New Zealand, of course, is technically we don't have a provincial system. We could argue we're the size of British Columbia, so we are a province. So having one bioeconomy framework for the entire country is much simpler for New Zealand than it was in Canada, where multiple provinces have their own drivers and own needs around bioeconomy frameworks. And so what we've seen is only recently has there been a national bioeconomy framework introduced into Canada that is being placed over the top of the various provincial frameworks. Something that has helped Canada introduce the bioeconomy more quickly perhaps than some others are probably two things, and this example is one that came from it. One was there was essentially a collapse of the traditional forest sector when we had the downturn during the global financial crisis, and also a downturn in the building industry in America, which is one of the largest markets. What that really required of the Canadian industries focused on the bioeconomy is they had to transform themselves and move away from traditional products in order to survive. So one of the initiatives that the Canadian government introduced, which I think was very successful and we may want to think about here in New Zealand, was the Investments in Forest Industry Transformation Program. In this program, the government put up approximately $200 million of funding, and that was matched by industry funding, 1 to 2. So the industry put up in total approximately $400 million so far. And the IFIT was really designed for first-of-kind deployment. It recognised that for industries to want to transform, they had to test some new technologies that they wouldn't otherwise be in a position to invest in. So the IFIT allowed industries to try new technologies, such as the one on the right, where they use lignin to make new adhesives and new other products, that allowed them to de-risk that technology sufficiently to scale it up for full-scale commercialization. Had IFIT not existed, it's quite likely the industry would not have been able to make that change. The other thing that Canada has done, which is I think very important as well, is the government has supported and introduced across the provinces and at federal level a range of codes and standards that support the bioeconomy. In this case, for example, work done by FB Innovations is around the guidelines for tall wood building and wood. This has allowed the codes for wood construction for larger than 6-story up to 12 and not even higher buildings to be built across Canada, because the policy and codes and standards allow construction companies who are interested in this area to do so without tedious regulatory changes. So 2 examples: the 18-story building that went up in UBC, 18-story wood building, the 13th-story building in Quebec City. The UBC building went up in just 9 weeks, 2 stories a week, which points to not only that wood construction is actually a low carbon construction, but it's actually very efficient in terms of low cost foundations, and using wood construction through engineered wood products means that you're not waiting for concrete to set or concrete to be poured. So it's a very efficient way also to build a building. in addition to the advantages of low carbon or carbon storage. I think one challenge for New Zealand that Canada doesn't have so much in terms of the bioeconomy is they have a very diverse investment landscape across the country and through federal government investment. So just some examples here of the various programs that Canada has put in place that support the bioeconomy or the low carbon economy, supporting both basic research through applied. Very important point around demonstrations, the ability to demonstrate and de-risk these technologies, helping with commercialization and market development, and then actual deployment of these bioeconomy, biotechnology solutions into market. This diversity of investment really means that they can get a critical mass right through the development chain and make sure that good science or good innovation in the bioeconomy actually gets taken through to full implementation. I think in New Zealand right now we don't have that sort of system, and I think if we are to pursue the bioeconomy or the industrial biotech space, then we need to think carefully about how we can support all elements of development, not just basic research, but all the way through to deployment. That'll be a challenge for a small country like New Zealand, but if I compare it to, say, to the province of British Columbia, which in many ways is of a similar size, both population-wise in terms of area and economy, these sort of programs have certainly been introduced into that province and have been very successfully implemented. Very important point from my perspective, strong learning, and one of the reasons I guess I went to Canada in 2014 is one of the challenges in the bioeconomy and biotech is they're very expensive. Unlike creating software systems or small electronic systems and so forth, scaling up these technologies takes a great deal of investment. Even a pilot plant in the biotech or bioeconomy space may well cost $10 to $50 million to build. And what's important in the bioeconomy space is that you have to build pilot plants that make enough product to test them in market. So as one of the scientists at Scion, I was very familiar with our capacity to build 1 gram or make 1 gram of material. But if I can't make a ton of that material or sufficient material to go into a processing chain, then the end users of that material are not going to be very interested. They want to know that they can make enough of this material to manufacture it through their process line and see that it actually behaves well in their production line, and also need to make enough material to test in the market. So one of the challenges in the bioeconomy is that we have to build reasonably large pilot plants, and they're expensive. So in Canada, what has been helpful for that is the ability for the government to co-invest both at the provincial level and the federal level for these large-scale projects. And these are just 3 examples in the forest bioeconomy space. Making nanocrystals, which are a very, very amazing product, of nanocrystalline cellulose, which is 10 times stronger than steel and can be used into all sorts of products, whether they're photonics or in concrete additives and so forth. Cellulose filaments can go into larger scale things that can be used for things like improving paper performance and packaging performance. And then lignin has many uses, including bioadhesive manufacturing and utilizing it in polymers and composites. But the challenge, very expensive to build, has to be of a certain scale to make it worthwhile. And in New Zealand at the moment, I think we would struggle to make some of these investments, given this is just one step in the critical de-risking process. So we have to think about how we can better do this. It may come down to having integrated capabilities across the country for scale up, much like the Food Innovation Network has done, or maybe having some centralized capacity that the government supports, perhaps at Callaghan. So I think this is important for us to understand that this is a critical step towards de-risking. Also, as a rule, you need to use local feedstocks. So although I guess it's potentially possible to send feedstocks overseas to run them through various pilot plants, it's not particularly practical to do that. So piloting of bioeconomy, biotech technologies typically has to happen reasonably locally. The other thing that Canada has been very good is in terms of leveraging cross-sectoral national synergies. So biodesign is something that is an enduring opportunity across agriculture and forestry in Canada. It's brought together all the key players, both from an industry and a research provider, academic and from a government perspective, to really focus on strategic areas for the bioeconomy, whether it's around sustainable living or clean transportation infrastructure. It is building off an existing infrastructure and initiatives across the country. So you can see in the middle on the Canadian map there are a number of innovation hubs and centres of excellence and clusters that are already existing in Canada, which has allowed them to bring this together. Plus, Canada does have the advantage of being close to some of the very large players in the bioeconomy, such as Ford, who are interested in bioeconomy, bio-alternatives for transportation. Some of the aviation industries are based obviously quite close to Canada. So these big users of materials, being close to Canada certainly is an advantage that New Zealand doesn't really have in terms of large-scale export of biomaterials or bioproducts. What we do have, which is comparable though, I think, to Canada, is we do have the opportunity for clusters. So we have the Latouk cluster, Sarnia cluster, Windsor cluster, and Thunder Bay cluster in Ontario and Quebec in Canada. These are reasonably close clusters. They're also built off existing infrastructure in the main. Thunder Bay and Windsor are basically building off the pulp and paper industry that already exists. Sarnia is building off the petrochemical industry that was located close to the US. Latouk is building off the forest infrastructure, forest harvesting infrastructure. We have comparable clusters of this type in New Zealand, such as around Kawerau, Tokoroa, up north in terms of forest resource. For us to think through. When we were building up various initiatives in Canada, we reached out across the industry and the sectors, both locally, nationally and internationally, and we basically asked them, what role do you feel science and innovation should play in the bioeconomy from their perspective? And I think these results would probably be quite comparable, I'm going to guess, here in New Zealand as well, as we got in North America and into Europe. So some of the roles for science innovation, they want us to help address market needs around diversifying their traditional product base as those product bases change. They know that there is a market demand for sustainable products. That's why you see companies like IKEA looking to go to 100% sustainable, because they know there's a market demand for that. You see it again in the automotive industry. What's really important for many of these industries, agriculture and forestry, is they want to add value to their underutilized feedstocks or byproducts. So they may have a primary product that they're producing, but they know there's a lot of value that they're not gathering by not utilizing these underutilized feedstocks, byproducts, or waste products. So that's where they want to see us address market needs. Secondly, they want to help them create an innovation pipeline. So they need to find that unique product line that suits their particular industry or their particular geography. So from that perspective, what they told us is they want more focus on feedstock development and conversion. So what to do with that material that is gathered from agriculture or forestry, and how to convert it into something that is either pre-ready for manufacturing or can be transported at lower cost. The problem with many bioeconomy feedstocks, of course, is their biomass and they're very high in water content. So moving a lot of water around the country to a manufacturing site can be a real problem. So pre-conversion of feedstocks can be an important element of the value chain. They want us to look at high value chemicals and materials. So one of the challenges there is they are typically commodity industries, so very high volumes. So they want to be able to make quite a high value chemical or material. Doesn't always align with commodity thinking. We're often looking to make the lowest cost material. The problem with many of the high value chemicals and materials that come out of bioeconomies is that they're relatively low volume. So if we look at the example in Canada around nanocellulose, the world market for nanocellulose right now is probably about 330 tons per year. So it doesn't get rid of a lot of forestry resources or agriculture resources. So one of the challenges with high value chemicals and materials is they also have to be high volume to really align with the industries that we're seeking to support. They want a lot of work on application and products because as much as you can enjoy making raw materials or commodity products to go into something, you need to make sure there's a market and an application for that material. And that means removing barriers to market development, such as being able to prove the sustainability of the material, prove that it has a low carbon or a zero carbon footprint, prove that it performs as well as the existing alternatives in the fossil fuel or the petrochemical markets that it's trying to replace. And also involves around supporting policy and regulatory change. And finally, in terms of actual research they're looking for from science, what they said is there are some critical investment criteria that we need support in. One is ensuring that they've got proof of concept for new opportunities, so they need to be able to show that these things actually can be made. They want to make sure that the current technical performance of some of these products can be improved. So some of the polymers that we've created out of the bioeconomy through industrial biotech and so forth don't perform necessarily as well as some of the petrochemical alternatives when it comes to function. And so we have to improve them if they're going to be a replacement. One of the biggest challenges I touched on earlier is these industries really need quite a lot of support around de-risking and scale up. And I think this is a critical requirement for New Zealand to go more into the bioeconomy space, is we need to have the capacity here from a science and innovation perspective to help industries de-risk the scale up of these technologies. So they go to an appropriate scale to attract investment, either from government or downstream investors who are interested in taking up the product and developing the companies that will develop them at full scale. They want enough material produced for product prototypes to go to market testing. And again, they want us to help from a science innovation perspective around market and regulatory barriers, which often comes down to proving the performance of the material, either from a sustainability perspective or from a technical manufacturing and in-use performance perspective. What I would say in all cases across the world, whether it's Canada, Sweden, US, Finland, Germany, etc., is what is critical for the bioeconomy and the biotech industry is you need a national bioeconomy strategy. I haven't seen any of these countries do this successfully without some sort of strategy that the bioeconomy is aligned to, and that hasn't been supported by both industry and government. So bioeconomy strategy is imperative, and New Zealand does not yet have a cohesive and integrated bioeconomy strategy. Or an industrial biotechnology strategy. So I think it's really important that we work together around how we create such a strategy to give guidance both to the industry, to the investors, and also to government in terms of policy and regs. What you will find when you look at these strategies, I took the Finnish one, but only because in reality, what you'll find is most of these strategies look essentially the same, no matter where you look in the countries around the world that are adopting bioeconomy. They all talk about having a competitive operating environment for the bioeconomy. That is essentially putting in place appropriate policies and regulations that at least don't impede the bioeconomy, but possibly and hopefully support the bioeconomy. So you'll see policy incentives in various countries, such as Finland, around supporting the adoption of bio-based materials into consumer goods products, for example, or supporting the elimination of single-use plastic products and so forth, all of which is supposed to help the operating environment for the bioeconomy. At least it's in its early stages before it becomes fully supported by its own growth. Secondly, you'll usually see statements in the bioeconomy strategies across the country related to the economy being supported through financing, so risk financing, that scale up I talked about earlier, ensuring that you're allowed to generate new concepts and new ideas, and that you can work across sectors, because the bioeconomy usually requires a balance between various sectors, whether it's forestry and agriculture on the biomass side, or downstream in terms of consumer products and large-scale manufacturing. Usually, as bioeconomy is a reasonably embryonic, the new bioeconomy at least being a reasonably embryonic area, there'll usually be a focus on education, training and supporting research. So we have people who are future leaders for this area. And most importantly, in many cases, around ensuring accessibility and availability of the biomass feedstock. That's ensuring that it will be available for long term. One of the challenges with the bioeconomy is people will invest in the infrastructure for manufacture of bioproducts only if there's a sustainable biomass. And then ironically, the people who produce the biomass will only produce it for those industries if they have sufficient infrastructure invested in. So there's a balance we have to maintain there between the capacity to invest in new infrastructure and the certainty that the biomass will be secured. And then finally, what we're seeing, and we know that Scion is certainly leading the way on this in New Zealand, and many of us are doing the same, is understanding that the bioeconomy itself is now changing. So we have the circular economy, which traditionally has been around recycling of materials. And if we look at industries like the aluminium industry and the steel industry, they're exceptionally good at recycling. The recovery rate of aluminium is very high, in the 90% plus. So they recover exceptionally well in terms of reusing that material and repurposing it. The bioeconomy, as we used to think about it, had a big focus on low carbon or bio-based materials, but a large focus initially was around compostability, disposability, the ability for it to degrade and disappear. That was a more traditional focus on the bioeconomy. As we move into the circular bioeconomy, we're actually looking at a different paradigm for the bioeconomy. It is really more of a focus on renewable resources as a feedstock. more on the focus that these are bio-based alternatives with a low carbon footprint. It's actually about being able to reuse these materials rather than simply compost or dispose them. And what that really requires for the circular bioeconomy is that we design these materials and products so they can cascade their use. So they start in one purpose and they get repurposed into different uses. Just as the aluminium industry does the same thing. It starts maybe with an aluminium can, but it ends up in another product further down the track. So developing and designing cascading use for the bioeconomy products is actually quite challenging because they are degradable and they tend to fall apart, and they're also not so easy to introduce into recycling systems. And one of the key elements of a circular bioeconomy, which differs maybe from the traditional bioeconomy, is you try to defer energy production to the end step. So whereas perhaps more traditionally would have gone straight to bioenergy production at the starting point, in a circular bioeconomy, you try to use bioenergy production near the end once you've basically extracted most of the add value through those cascading uses. Within ag research, we're certainly very interested in the bioeconomy, and of course, the agriculture sector is a bioeconomy by all definitions. As we're moving forward into the bioeconomy and ag research, what we're really looking for is how do we manage those net zero losses and emissions through recovering as much value off the farm systems and avoiding any waste materials or pollutants. How can we ensure through bioeconomy approaches that farm industries and enterprises stay prosperous? That may require some diversification from current traditional products into some of these other bio-based products and use of other byproducts. And how we build the food and beverage exports from New Zealand to be a greater enterprise. And some of that will come from exporting bioeconomy products, such as packaging and so forth, that go with those food products. What New Zealand therefore needs from a bioeconomy perspective, certainly from our perspective and our analysis at ag research, is we're a long way from anywhere in New Zealand. And we have real challenges around logistics. So we have to offer very distinctive value propositions for the bioeconomy if we're going to be a strong exporter of this sort of technology and these sort of products. So from our perspective, that means focusing on production systems that have more digitalization, that are generated from an ethical perspective, because consumers are looking for ethical production, whether it's animal welfare or carbon footprint or environmental performance, or aligning to social license. Resilient agriculture is important because if there are issues like outbreaks of disease and pests, or we can't maintain production of our systems because of climate change, then of course we don't have a long-term prospect of generating these materials. And then it's around combining smart foods and beyond foods, so the biomaterials, bioproducts and so forth that are not part of the food chain, but come with it with agriculture, like the better use of wool. And then it's about listening to the consumer and what they're looking for in this space and designing products that are appropriate to consumer needs, both here in New Zealand, but also into markets where they have different drivers and different needs. So one of the areas we're certainly looking at is the idea of a pastoral biorefinery, much like a forest biorefinery. So can we take our capacity in New Zealand to grow grass exceptionally well, extract proteins from it for bioproduction and other uses, and extract other materials from the farming system, and still be able to feed the animals that we're looking for to produce as our core primary product for the industry. And this is work that's certainly been done elsewhere, such as in Ireland. So pastoral biorefineries are certainly being pursued very strongly in Ireland. Bottom line from my perspective is the call to arms, I think, for New Zealand is there is significant opportunities and advantages here in New Zealand that others don't have. Our capacity to integrate agriculture and forestry into a singular area, the fact that we are one single economy and that we don't have provincial limitations around investment, the fact that we're seen as a very innovative and safe place to de-risk technologies is an example. So what I'd like to see New Zealand do is bring together a bioeconomy framework that we all got signed into, engage our scientists, communities, government, industries around the new breakthrough science that will create the innovative concepts that are new for New Zealand, that we're not just copying what others are doing, so we need some innovation of our own, scaling them up through technology platforms that align to market drivers, de-risking those players in the industry in the commercial space who want to deploy these. So that means de-risking their scale up and providing the infrastructure to do that. And then connecting those innovations to non-conventional partners and non-traditional stakeholders. So many of the people interested in the bioeconomy are going to be non-traditional players for New Zealand. They'll be in downstream processing, say in automotive, downstream processing such as the aviation industry and so forth. Some of us who work, say, in agriculture don't normally work with those sort of people. So to connect them to the bioeconomy, we need to reach out and connect them to that. So in summary, one of our summary slides in Canada around this sort of focus was we need to embrace innovation. We need to make sure we maintain jobs for rural communities and our Māori communities, because they are particularly focused on rural location and future-proofing their mokopuna. And then how do we maintain sustainable ecosystems is all part of the bioeconomy pitch. That's what Canada is looking for, and there's simply no reason we couldn't do the same here in New Zealand by embracing our own innovation, protecting our rural jobs and communities across New Zealand, and maintaining our own sustainable ecosystems. That's what I wanted to present to you. So as Sarah indicated, I'm more than happy to take any questions either directly as part of the session or afterwards. So thank you, Sarah.
Thank you so much, Trevor. Now I see we've got some very, very knowledgeable people online, so I'm hoping that some good questions are going to come through. But I wanted to ask you, Trevor, is again, this is my area of passion around the biotech sector and the bioeconomy. Do you see New Zealand ever, not ever, that's not probably the right word, but do you see New Zealand picking up a bioeconomy strategy, which you just mentioned it would be great to see? Do you think we're going to see that framework?
Well, I see absolutely no reason why we couldn't work together to create one. They're not particularly difficult to do. We can certainly take all sorts of strategies from around the world. The real challenge perhaps is in adopting such a bioeconomy strategy is what will be our distinctive offering in the bioeconomy. Caveating that with the fact that we are a bioeconomy. Clearly we are a bioeconomy, but if we define a new bioeconomy, then how do we become part of that new bioeconomy? Some of the drivers of the bioeconomy internationally have gone well beyond our expectations previously. And these days, the ability to say we have a low carbon product or it's sustainable is a given for our consumers. It's not something you sell or have a premium on. And so for us to really make this work, we have to define what about the New Zealand bioeconomy is compelling and different from other bioeconomies in all sorts of ways that make it appropriate for the investment that will be required. To move our current bioeconomy to a new bioeconomy will come with a great deal of investment need. And so I do believe we need a national framework that means we're all aligned to a common purpose with common arguments and a common set of impact measures that will tell us how to get there. But the challenge, I think, will be determining what our distinctiveness is in this country relative to others.
Because I know right now we're working through the ITPs, the industry transformation plans. Is that something you see that could be a bioeconomy ITP, or is it somehow trying to weave the bioeconomy through the industry transformation plans, or do you see that really it does need to have its own framework?
I think it's sufficiently different from some of the others. I mean, the ITPs that have been generated so far are really impressive and very exciting, but they don't really touch on these sort of large scale biotech or bioeconomy concepts per se. They don't address some of the challenges of the bioeconomy around investment support or scale up directly as a need. And so I think there's important room to create an ITP type framework or a framework for the bioeconomy for New Zealand, even if it is about acknowledging the current bioeconomy we have and how we future-proof it.
No.
So we don't have to go for all the whiz-bang things that others are doing necessarily. No one's suggesting that the whole country can turn into a bioplastics company, like they've done with Cargill Dow in some of the states in the states in the Corn Belt. But surely there must be opportunities here. Maybe our niche is more around those distributed regional symbiosis centres. Maybe our niche is about creating small, more self-sufficient bioeconomies in the regions where they're providing maybe some of their own materials for their own purposes. Maybe it's about repurposing some of our existing primary industries to do that. I suspect that's more where we'll go, because I suspect as New Zealand, I mean, to put it in context, the way I always look at it, we only have one oil refinery in New Zealand. So to think that we're going to have 10 biorefineries in New Zealand is probably unlikely unless they're quite small and maybe quite niche.
Yeah. Now, Brian Cox, I saw you put your hand up. I'm not that technically savvy, so I'm not sure what that means, but if you've got a question, if you can just type it in the Q&A, that would be great. I have a number of questions. I'm going to start with Michael Lakeman. Love the Pastoral Biorefinery concept. How downscalable are the component technologies and how distributable are they? Interested in the fit of this concept with a thinly distributed resource like grass.
Yeah, great question, Michael. So when you look at the Irish experience, basically they're operating their pastoral biorefinery almost at the farm level. So what a lot of what they're doing is essentially, if you could picture it, they mow the lawn or they mow the grass, and at the same time it goes through a processor on the back of the processor of the harvester, and they squeeze out the juice on demand. They recover the protein and the fibers on the farm itself. So what they're really doing there, of course, the need for the biorefinery, pastoral biorefinery, is you can't take all the feedstock off the farm and then bring it back. That doesn't make any logistical sense. So you've really got to do the pre-processing on farms. So pastoral biorefineries, to a point, can work at the farm level, and then you can gather up the other materials, the recovered proteins and fibers and so forth, and then you can take them to a central processing facility, which may take the form of a cooperative. You know, I've always said the pastoral biorefinery could work just as easily as a dairy milk cooperative around 100 farms or so, all taking that material there, and these sort of materials are scalable at that sort of scale as well.
So that kind of leads to Graham has asked, why do you think it's impractical to ship raw materials to an offshore pilot plant?
It's not impractical, and it has been done. I've seen it done. It's just there's a few challenges around stability of the material. It's just expensive. If the raw materials aren't pre-processed quite considerably on site, you certainly don't want to be sending things that are perishable, like grasses or things like that. Wood chips and so forth you can do, or you can use them over there. It's not impractical, but it's certainly not necessarily economic to do it. And we have done it many times. And certainly in Canada, it's not unusual to send stuff up to Finland and so forth to have it run. But it's a reasonably expensive option to do.
We got a question from Anna Yallop, and hi Anna, meaning to catch up with you. So I think this is a really good question. Do you think that we're moving more to an onshore resilience approach than an export focus principally?
I think I hate to be that person who says it every time, but post-COVID, I think we are looking to be more self-resilient as a country. So I think there is opportunity for us to be more niche around smaller scale manufacture of bioeconomy products that are for our own purpose. And I think there is value in doing so. And also, I guess I often think that New Zealand's full scale is for other people pilot scale. So the opportunity in some ways to manufacture full scale here in New Zealand for ourselves and de-risk technologies, from discussions I've had overseas, that is seen as relatively attractive. So New Zealand is seen as quite an interesting place because of its economy and the nature of our society as a good place to manufacture this sort of material as a de-risking opportunity for technologies or bioeconomy opportunities. So that may have a double win, Anna, in terms of both being able to scale up production for ourselves and provide that onshore resilience, but also help others internationally de-risk those technologies, and then we could export those technologies offshore. But I think New Zealand's learning from some of these drivers around rural economy and self-sufficiency is important, and I think we may have to think about how we scale down some of these biorefinery and bioeconomy concepts to be more onshore resilient and more focused on domestic markets. So I think that's a good question.
A question from Alan. Based on your vast experience in industrial biotech, which technologies can we adopt or adapt for the New Zealand bioeconomy?
Yeah, vast experience could be an over-exaggeration, but I think many. I guess for myself personally, there's somewhere in between the very precise and very expensive sort of biomedical production of pharmaceuticals and so forth, which is both expensive and risky because of the certification and testing that's needed for that from FDA and so forth. And somewhere between that and going up to the very large scale fermentation systems, which are billion-dollar systems. If you look at the Cargill Dow PLA plant, very, very expensive systems. So I think we're looking for something at an intermediate level where the scale that we have is more manageable. One of the advantages we do have in New Zealand, and it's one that we didn't have in British Columbia when I was there, is that our feedstocks, because we do intensive production of both agriculture and forestry, our feedstocks are quite close to potential production systems. Whereas if I look at British Columbia, that was a problem because they were driving many hundreds of kilometres to deliver the feedstock because everything was dispersed. So I think opportunities for me around things like ones that have low energy needs or use sustainable energy. So the work we were doing initially a number of years ago, and which has now continued on in Karawel, around using our geothermal resources as an energy source for industrial biotech, I think is very good. I think around niche manufacture of various types of polymers, I think could be very interesting for industrial biotech. And then I think there's some opportunities we have around hybrid systems, around introducing both biotech and chemical technologies together. But certainly the immediate capital cost issues that we can address is probably adapting some of the existing processing facilities we already have, such as introducing industrial biotech to a pulp and paper plant here in New Zealand, rather than greenfields.
I was just writing notes if you're wondering what cool, this is really good stuff. What's preventing either universities or the industry from engaging with industry research?
A number of things probably. In industry is usually looking for something that's relatively de-risked. So for early stage research and industry in the universities, you know, that ability to get through that low return, high risk sort of research aim is a problem. As I said earlier, one of the challenges here in New Zealand, we have relatively limited diversity of funding for this sort of research. And then, as I also noted in my talk, at some point quite soon in the industry research process, they look to scale up. And if the universities or the industries don't have that scale up capacity, then that will be a limitation for them to take it much further than really proof of concept here in New Zealand. And I think that'll be a challenge. So two things for me are probably the diversity of funding that allows us to go from blue skies through to applied research in the space and prototyping, and then the capacity to provide scale up facilities or scale up opportunities for the industry to take it to a stage where they can actually be more confident in the investment. So New Zealand in many ways is quite risk averse around new technologies. So I think we need to support that.
Andrew Kelly, thanks for putting that in the Q&A. I was trying to read the chat at the same time, but he says it's obvious to think about Pinus radiata or pastoral grasses as candidates, but how hard would the path be to establish new species as novel candidates?
I actually think, thanks Andrew, I think that's actually a really important point. Yeah, we do have sort of these, what could be argued are these vanilla products in radiata and pastoral grasses that also have a current purpose. I think I would think there's a great opportunity there to diversify some of the other species that we could utilize. You know, I saw Brian Cox's name there, so some of the other opportunities around the work that he's been pursuing around miscanthus and so forth on behalf of the Bioenergy Association of New Zealand, etc. So I think there are opportunities to do that, and I think in reality, I guess one of the things that interested me when I was over in Canada is whether some of the species that New Zealand has of its own might be better for providing that niche. And we're certainly seeing some of that happening when we look at some of our Māori clients and stakeholders that we're working with at AgResearch around some of their use of native plants and so forth for bioactive production and so forth. So maybe one of our niches will be to look to diversify our forest resource or agricultural systems to provide some of those niche feedstocks that are different from what others can do. So whilst I appreciate, and obviously with my background, radiata is a wonderful, fast-growing wood, there are other countries who can do that as well. And the prime example we always look at there is Brazil also can grow raw materials for biorefineries extremely fast, and also are allowed to use GE to do so. So yeah, I think, Andrew, a good question. I think it's about diversifying maybe in some niche feedstocks that are different from others will be important. And great opportunities for sustaining those rural economies as they do that.
Yeah. Now, Brian's written an essay here, so basically starts with welcome back. It's great that you're back to help us with this great opportunity underway. In New Zealand, we suffer from a lack of hunger for investment into new product areas by both agriculture and forestry, who seem very comfortable with their current products. In Canada, the drive came from the need for forestry to reform itself. Have you evidence of other countries or communities who have managed to stimulate the government, landowners in forestry who are initially uninterested?
So I think the example I would certainly give is into Scandinavia around Sweden and Finland, where I think if you read their strategies and so forth, they're not being driven by crisis. They're being driven by opportunity, and they're being driven by how they can diversify their primary industries. So I would say at the time, certainly Scandinavian, was less interested, although they've always been leaders in general thinking. But they became interested when they saw how some of the investment models could stimulate, the bioeconomy more broadly. They overcame some of the challenges. So one of the challenges in parts of Scandinavia is, much like in New Zealand in many ways, they have a lot of woodlot models. So we have families who own small amounts of forestry, where it's not economic for someone who owns 10 hectares of forest to become part of the bioeconomy. So what they have certainly adopted is some policies that encourage collectivism and creating these cooperatives and creating these bioeconomy brokers who are able to bring all that feedstock together and do it. So I would think Scandinavia is a good example where, rather than responding to a crisis, they look to an opportunity. And that's why, again, as I mentioned earlier, you see IKEA going to 100% sustainable products, not because they have to get out of petrochemicals, it's because they see that there's a market need for it. So those are good examples I think we can learn from.
Yeah. Sorry, I am jumping around a little bit with some of these questions, but I really like this one from Graham Harris. Thanks, Trevor. We have a couple of large industrial facilities with life cycle issues, Tiwai Point, Marsden Point. Are they candidates for repurposing?
They could be. I guess both have challenges. If we use those two examples, Tiwai Point is very useful from a low energy source, or low cost electricity in theory, I guess. The problem with Tiwai, I guess, from a biomaterials perspective, a bioeconomy perspective, there's not so much of the feedstock down there. So you'd have to offset the cost of transporting the feedstock from elsewhere to Tiwai probably to make it work. Marsden Point's got a different issue. One of the problems with Marsden Point is, like with all oil refineries, basically, and Brian Cox will be familiar with this for sure. An oil refinery right now that's refining fossil oil is not going to suddenly switch over to biomass or bio oil production at the flick of a hat. These are 365 24-hour 7-day a week operations. They work at very high efficiencies and can't be turned off at any time. Many of us, I saw John Gifford was online there as well, many of us would have experienced the concept of going into an oil refinery and saying, would you mind switching over for 2 weeks and we'll just make some really interesting bio oil or bio-based products. These refineries are not going to do that. They're really not going to do that, whilst they can still make good money from fossil fuel production. So in theory, yes. It might be more a case of brownfielding and using some of the infrastructure of Marsden Point, like its capacity to ship materials onshore and offshore, particularly offshore if we're making biofuels, for example, and some of the other infrastructure that it has, and then put some brownfields operations to the side of it. The advantage of Marsden Point is certainly it's surrounded by some very interesting forests up at Taitokoro and so forth that would be a good feedstock for it. So those large systems it's an interesting question, Graham. Repurposing will be difficult, but there's certainly some interesting opportunities there.
Yeah. Now I've got two questions around CRIs and universities. The one is, do you think there is more collaboration or competition between CRIs and small biotech startups in New Zealand?
I guess the question is whether, in terms of understanding that question, is it competition between CRIs each or the two? So I mean, my own view as someone who's in a CRI, I don't think we should compete. If it's about biotech, I don't think we should be competing with small biotechs at all. We should be supporting them. So I think CRIs have to understand or be clear about our role here. As I've said a number of times recently, our role in commercialization of these sort of biotech or bioeconomy products is that we should stay in the scale up and development of these things as long as is necessary, but no longer. So that may be that we get out quite early and license it to a biotech, or we stay long enough to give confidence to investors that we're helping de-risk the technology. But I'm not sure that CRIs typically are particularly good at going all the way through to startup as a rule. Not that it hasn't happened, of course. So I think our role is really to help the biotech startups and support them, maybe with infrastructure, maybe with some of the investment strategies, and also with some of the foresighting that we can help them with, as well as the scientific and technical support. So I don't think we should be competing. We should be collaborating very deeply. My own view, having been to Canada and came back or looked at Sweden and Finland, New Zealand should really work together around this as a common interest, and that's back to your question, Sarah, about needing a national bioeconomy framework. I think we're too small a country to be fighting with each other and looking for little niches for ourselves. We need to come together collectively and really commit to something big. And that's what you see happening in Finland and Sweden, which are about the same size as we are. You see that deep commitment for industry and government to work together to create this opportunity at a national level.
You're just touching on that in terms of CRIs challenging getting their technology into startups. Where do you see the issues there?
Well, it's probably back to my earlier point. It's around the capacity to take some very early stage blue skies material or concepts and scale them up to a size where the startup can start investing in production. One of the challenges, as I said earlier, in terms of biotech and bioeconomy is my experience is you typically have to make enough product for the market to test it. So that is a challenge for startups, to make enough product that the market will actually test it and be comfortable with it, both from a production and a market attractiveness perspective. Yeah. And then I think it is about the challenges around IP protection and our ability to invest and protect IP, which CRIs often don't always have the resources to sufficiently protect the IP, nor sometimes, I guess in my experience, do we do enough analysis of the opportunity size and risk. So if there's one challenge I think I've experienced in CRIs is sometimes we don't necessarily understand the value of the biotech or bioeconomy opportunity, and maybe for that reason we hold on to it a bit too long because we're not sure of the value of it. If we had more certainty about the opportunity and the cost of investment and the risks, then I think we'd be able to go to more of these biotech startups and make a good proposition and go to the investment bodies for more private investment or public and show that there's a real opportunity here rather than holding on to it too long, which I think CRIs occasionally can do.
Now, Alexandra's got another really good question. Do you think New Zealand's ready or willing to create, and I don't know who these are, but CERES or a BIRNet countrywide network?
Yeah, so thanks, Alex. So what she's referring to is in a number of the countries, such as in Finland or Canada, what they've done is create these national networks where all the academic researchers, the research organisations like the CRIs, industry and governments have got together for a singular network, and they've coordinated across a number of themes, and they've co-invested in that discussion we just had about de-risking the technology and creating startups, and supporting and bringing on board, because of that critical mass. BioNet was successful and continues to be successful because it was sufficiently large. BioNet had 22 universities and 126 professors and researchers from across research organisations, had 32 industry players, and had all the provinces and federal government together. What that meant is it was one voice, which was very important. And what it meant is large players like IKEA and Ford and Air Canada wanted to come and talk to them because they knew they'd basically captured the innovation ecosystem for that space. And therefore they could work into that and find the places that they wanted to invest. So I think it is important. We can do that. There's no reason we can't do that. But I suppose, like all such networks, you need some underpinning support, which is the usual CRI mantra, I know, but you need some underpinning investment to create a centre of gravity that these people want to work together. So as I've often said in New Zealand, I think my experience is we all want to collaborate after we've all won our own money. And I think what it will usually take for these sort of networks is you need some pre-investment, typically by government, I have to say, to bring everyone together and keep them together.
Yeah. Now look, we've got 2 minutes left, and I think you've done an amazing job, Trevor, with all those questions. And I am very, very excited about you sitting on the BioTech board, because now I have access to your knowledge, and also we as a group can start thinking about how do we bring some of these big challenges, to the fore. And as I said, a national bioeconomy framework would be, amazing to get across the line. It would be, so thank you very much for today. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you very much for your time for your presentation. Again, great answers. Thank you very much for everybody who is on the line and put those questions forward. We had some great people listening in. So I am going to say thank you to everybody. And usually this is when I kind of hand over a bottle of wine, but maybe when we finally can do face-to-face. But I want to say thank you very much, and thank you for everybody. So yeah, thank you, Trevor.
Well, thank you for the opportunity. Thank you for the opportunity, Zara. And I want to emphasise, these are just my personal perspectives on my observations. Welcome the opportunity for us to connect more across the attendees and beyond. I'm confident in returning to New Zealand. We have a great opportunity in the biotech and bioeconomy area. It will obviously come with challenges, but I see some really distinctive and unique opportunities for New Zealand to really embrace this. So welcome anyone who wants to reach out and discuss that and see how we can make something happen in this space.
Yeah.
So many thanks.
Yeah, and we're just getting through the chats, people saying thank you, Trevor. So thank you from
You're welcome.
the attendees. See you later. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you, everyone.
See you all. Bye.